Okay, so we are ready to start on this module. As I said, this module, but the entire afternoon are dedicated to the monitoring framework. And now we will start looking at the dimensions and the components. But before that, just want to mention that, so we're going to present the slides in English, but you have printed handouts in French, so you are able to follow the slides in that handout. And also, please keep that also for tomorrow, because that slide set also includes the content for tomorrow morning. Okay, so in this segment of Module 3, we will look at the framework, as I said, the dimensions and the components. We will also introduce the questionnaire, but actually not looking at question by question, which is simply impossible in this training. We will need more time for that. And but looking at the elements of the questionnaire, really to identify the different reporting roles and also what is needed from the national coordinators in terms of coordinating with other partners from which we'll be needing data. But okay, I think I had at the contrary. So let's start with the framework. And here you see indeed an overview of its content. And we can see that the monitoring promotes collective accountability through the lens of the 4 effectiveness principles that you see on the left side. And it does it by generating evidence and results around 4 thematic areas or dimensions that we see here in bold. Indeed, the monitoring exercise generates data and results about the whole of society approach to development, which is an important element of the 2030 agenda. There is evidence on the state and the use of country systems for development cooperation. There is evidence on transparency and evidence on leaving no one behind. Next to each dimension, we see several components, and these components indicate in more details the results that will be associated with each of the 4 dimensions. You can also see that the monitoring includes 3 SDG indicators, and we will look at them as we go dimension by dimension. But before that, I just want to highlight 2 things from the framework. Well, first of all, is that it keeps the measurements from previous monitoring exercises, and this really allows to generate trends. We saw that this is very important for accountability. For example, we see here like measurements related to predictability, to the use of public financial management systems, transparency, and so on. Only one exception. For those who have done the monitoring in 2018, there was an assessment on the quality of public-private dialogue, and that assessment is now broadened and incorporated into the Kampala Principles assessment, so the assessment on private sector engagement in development cooperation. Second element is that starting from this round, in addition to these key measurements, we will also have supporting qualitative complementary evidence. So this will let emerge also action that has been done by the country governments or by development partners, for example, to strengthen systems. But this will be also helpful to let emerge good examples or challenges that countries and partners are facing to implement the commitments. And this will be particularly important during the phase of the reflection on the results, on the dialogue, because it can really help the reflections and also identifying the action that is needed to improve. So, moving now to the first dimension of the framework, this is about the whole of society approach to development. And here, the monitoring gathers evidence on the extent to which a diversity of stakeholder groups are involved in the development process. We see here 4 components The first one is about engagement and dialogue. And here the exercise captures the extent to which governments engage and dialogue with subnational governments, with civil society organizations, with the private sector, but also with foundations, trade unions, for example, when defining their national development strategies, their priorities, or actually when also following up on the national development plans, in the progress reports, or in joint accountability assessments towards development cooperation. And similarly, the monitoring also looks at how development partners dialogue and engage with a diversity of stakeholder groups when they define the country-level strategies in your countries. The second component gives an insight on how country governments, but also development partners are together facilitating parliamentary oversight over development cooperation. And this is done in two ways. So by capturing the regularity with which countries actually share information about development cooperation with the parliaments, but also looking at the amounts and the share of development cooperation that is recorded into national budgets. This is based, of course, on the information that your country receives from development partners, and then this allows you to record that information also in the budget, which then is submitted for approval to your parliaments. The third component is about the CSO enabling environment. So this is a comprehensive assessment to look at the perception of governments, development partners, and civil society organizations on the environment that favors the engagement and the contribution of CSOs to development. So we will have actually this afternoon a more detailed presentation on that assessment from our colleague from GPEDC, from the CSO Partnership on Development Effectiveness. So I won't go in a lot of details here because we have a dedicated moment for that. The fourth component is about private sector engagement, and similarly here, at the end of this afternoon, we're going to have a dedicated presentation from my colleague Ashley to go on the details. And this is really about looking at the enabling environment to facilitate working with the private sector in development cooperation. So from this assessment, we will have the perception of the different actors related to private sector engagement. So moving now to the second dimension of the framework, we are talking here about the key features of core systems for development cooperation in a country, but also at how development partners align to those systems and make use of those systems when they operate in the country. So there are several components within this dimension, and the first one is related to planning and the quality of national development strategies and other planning instruments. So here, the monitoring really look at the characteristic of the development plan or the development strategy in place in your country, looking at its inclusivity, looking at the objectives, the targets that it defines, looking at elements like the inclusion of an alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals and other elements. The second component is actually related to SDG indicator 17.15.1, which looks at the use of country results frameworks and planning tools by providers of development cooperation when they indeed intervene in your countries. And this gives an indication of the respect for countries, policy space, and leadership in defining and implementing policies for poverty eradication and for sustainable development. Third element is about the public financial management systems. And here, the monitoring looks at the quality of these systems in the country, looking at different aspects of them that we will see into more details. But also, again, on how development partners make use of these systems when they channel development cooperation through the public sector in your countries. Last element in the slide is about the national budget. And here we are looking at elements that influence the capacity of the government to budget what is related to resources coming from development cooperation. So here the monitoring looks at elements like predictability. As I mentioned earlier, you need to have information from development partners in order to be able to plan and coordinate and define the use of such resources. And also to make sure that resources are then reflected in the budget. So moving to the next slide, but still within this dimension. So here we're talking actually about SDG 5C1, which is looking at whether countries have in place systems to track and make public budget allocations for gender equality and women empowerment. So here the monitoring look at the existence of such policies for gender equality, but in particularly at how they then are linked to specific budgets and whether such allocations are publicly available and they are transparent. Next element is about the accountability mechanism for development cooperation in place in a country. And here the monitoring assess the quality of such mechanism by looking at the existence, for example, of a policy framework for development cooperation, whether this framework includes specific country-level targets for the government, but also for the other partners, and whether these targets are then tracked through a joint assessment that are inclusive with the different partners and that are then transparent when it comes to looking at the results of these assessments. Next element is about the information management systems for development cooperation. And here we are talking, for example, of AIMS, the Aid Information Management Systems, or other types of systems in your country to really collect and track the information of what development partners provide to your country, which type of projects and different elements. So we look at this, the comprehensiveness of this of such systems, but also very importantly whether development partners are actually using such systems. They are reporting to the systems and they are reporting the information that you are asking them at the regularity you are asking them. So the last component within this dimension is related to procurement systems. And here we are talking about procurement for what concerns untied aid. So untied aid means removing the legal and regulatory barriers to open competition for aid-funded procurement. So aid is untied where the donor doesn't put conditions on who, for example, is implementing, which company from which country is implementing the project in your country. So here we look at untied aid, looking at the behavior of development partners. Next dimension is about transparency, and here we are looking at the action of partner country governments and development partners to make the information related to development cooperation publicly available. So there are...
Sorry, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead. So going back to transparency. So as I said, related to whether partner countries, but also development partners are making publicly available the information related to their development cooperation. So for example, for the country, whether the national development plan is publicly available online, accessible to citizens, or similarly, whether the progress reports around this plan are also publicly available, results also of the joint accountability assessments. From the side of the development partners, similarly, whether also they have their country level strategy accessible and publicly available online, because this really ensures that citizens have access to it and make also And it's also good, I would say, for coordination of the different efforts of partners, if we know what the others are doing, and we can get the information easily. And within this, for development partners, and here similar to untied aid, there is no data collection for this at the country level, but the monitoring looks at the quality of reporting of development partners to global standard transparency systems or mechanisms. For example, the reporting to the International Aid Transparency Initiative or reporting to the OECD creditor reporting system. So moving to the fourth dimension, here we are talking about leaving no one behind and looking at the efforts by partner country governments and development partners to meet the pledge to leave no one behind. And this is really related to what is linked and relevant for the effectiveness agenda. We have here three components. So the first one is related to consultation. And here, the monitoring looks at whether development partners and partner country governments include and consult a diversity of population groups, including women and girls, youth and children, but also vulnerable and marginalized groups, which of course may vary depending on the country context. So whether they engage them and they consult them when they are defining the priorities in their national development strategies, engaging them also in the progress reports and in the dialogue related to tracking progress on the implementation of the strategy, and also in, again, like involving them in accountability, in dialogue related to joint assessment related to accountability. Second component here is related to targets and results, and here the monitoring looks at whether the national development strategies or the country-level strategies of development partners actually include development objectives, but also targets and results indicators that are specific for different groups of the population. Again, like I put emphasis on women and girls, youth and children. This is also because the Nairobi outcome document reconfirmed the importance to focus on them. And of course, also on the vulnerable and most marginalized. Moving then to the third component here, this really puts emphasis on the importance of data and statistics, especially at disaggregate level, to make sure that we identify who are those left behind, and then we can actually follow up. Well, first of all, identify targets specific for them, but then also use the data and the statistics to monitor progress towards the targets that we have identified. So you may recall that at the beginning I mentioned that there are 3 SDG indicators included in the framework. So you may be wondering where is the third one, because I mentioned only 2. So the third one is SDG 17.16.1, which actually looks at whether a country or a development partner has made progress in the GPEDC monitoring framework. So this is based on different measurements that compose our framework, and really gives an indication for progress in a multi-stakeholder monitoring framework that track effective of development cooperation. So in this case, it's actually us from the joint support team that, as part of the results from the monitoring and from the different elements, we will be then, based on the methodology approved by the United Nations, calculate the results for this indicator and share as part of the result package that you will have after the monitoring exercise. So I think we can maybe stop here for some questions, clarification from your side, before then moving to the next part. So if there are no other questions, I will move to next part of the presentation. And here I will be introducing the questionnaire And then, as I mentioned, like looking also at the different reporting roles and what it's needed in terms of coordination to be able to report on the different aspect of the questionnaire. So the questionnaire is the main instrument to collect data for those measurements indeed that require country level data, country level information. We saw that there are some elements of the framework that actually do not demand country data collection because they are coming from global available sources. So I mentioned anti-date, we mentioned transparency, and there is also the element on the quality of public financial management systems, which is also available from the PEFA assessment, which is public expenditure and financial assessment. Thank you. I always miss this one. Accountability, yes, which is available if countries have indeed shared it publicly. I also want to mention that there are two versions of the questionnaire. One is the standard version, and the other one is an adaptation of the questionnaire for countries that are facing conflict or they are in a situation of fragility. So this is something new that countries can choose to report indeed with this adapted version starting from this monitoring round. And this is really to recognize that in such context, implementing the commitments may be more challenging and also allow to let emerge some of the specific challenges, but also the action that governments and development partners are doing in the country to overcome such challenges. So for some background, this is the culmination of the work of an open working group which was set up in 2018 by the steering committee of the GPEDC. And this group composed of members of G7 plus countries, but also of the CSO platform for peace building and state building, and also the International Network on Conflict and Fragility. So they work together to come up with the contours for the adaptation of the framework for such context. And during the reform, these contours identified between 2018 and 2019 have been then translated in this adapted version of the questionnaire. So this is the choice here is really for the countries. So countries that see that this is relevant for their situation, if they are in such context of fragility, exposed to political, economic, social, and security risk, or where there is ongoing conflict, they may choose to report using this adaptation. But really, the choice here is on the country. If there are some of you who are interested in knowing more about this, because this may fit with your context, do not hesitate to come to us in the joint support team, and we will be happy to provide more details. So going back to questionnaire, well, of course, the national coordinator is responsible and is in the leadership of the process in all the phases of the exercise. But you may have seen that for practical reasons, the questionnaire is actually divided in different elements depending on who is the main reporter of the information. So there are elements of the questionnaire that require the government answers because they are linked to behaviors of the government. There are some elements that require information from development partners, and other elements of the framework that actually need reporting from the government, from development partners, and also from other stakeholders, and may also require consultation and dialogue in order to come up with the responses. So let's start with those elements of the framework that actually request reporting from you, from the national coordinator, from the government. So when you open the questionnaire, the first element that you see is related to the national development strategy or national development plans and results framework. So here you will really have the questions related to these plans, to these frameworks. So as I mentioned earlier, here is where you find the question, for example, on whether this was developed in an inclusive manner, whether you have consulted like civil society, the private sector, subnational governments, whether there are actually targets, results indicators also for vulnerable and marginalized. This is to allow indeed the evidence on leaving no one behind. And there are also questions related to whether actually the country has data and statistics available to then track progress on the objectives and the targets that you have identified in your strategies. So in order to report on this element of the framework, it will be very important to coordinate across the government. So we heard indeed that in some countries, responsibilities are really shared across different offices, across different ministries. So here it's very important that you, depending on how the setup is in your country, it's important that you coordinate with other government's office in order to report this information. And we can anticipate already that there are questions relatively to the data and statistics. And here will be very important also to link up with the National Statistical Office in your country, because they may help you indeed responding to such questions. Moving to the second element that you find in the questionnaire, these are the questions related to assess the quality of the accountability mechanism for development cooperation. And here is where you find those questions related to whether you have a policy framework for development cooperation, whether there are targets for the different partners, whether actually you assess progress on these targets, and you do it in an inclusive manner, bringing together the different stakeholders and then publishing the results of those assessments. So in order to report to this element, would be helpful for you to verify if your country has actually participated in the most recent survey of the UN Development Cooperation Forum. So we know that the last one took place between 2021 and 2022. So the results of this survey are not publicly available, but if your country has been involved, you may want to use the responses that you have provided in that assessment, because some elements are helpful to respond to this assessment too. And maybe it's also helpful, if you are in doubt, to reach out to the resident coordinator office, who can help you, like letting you know if the country indeed has reported to the last survey. Next element here is related to information about forward-looking spending plans that you receive from your development partners and national budget. So here, basically, you will be reporting on whether you have availability of such plans, so whether development partners have actually shared with you and you have received this multi-year planning information, and linked to that, whether then development cooperation is recorded on the national budget. So for you to report on that, you may also need to consult with different offices, or maybe in the case you mentioned in the Democratic Republic of Congo, maybe also check with colleagues at the subnational level. So to make sure that you have the comprehensive response for this element of the framework. And you will need to respond for all the partners that you have invited to report in this round. And of course, you will be consulting also the budget document to look really at whether the development cooperation of a specific partner is included that and in what amount. The next element here is, you will see again, SDG 5C1. And here you will be responding to these questions that indeed allow to calculate this indicator. So questions related to the policies in place, the legislation for gender equality and women empowerment, how then these policies are translated into concrete budget allocations, and how these public allocations are, how these allocations are made public. So to respond to these questions, you may need to coordinate with the budget office or with the ministry who is responsible for gender-related issues, depending on your country setup. And here will be also helpful for you to seek support from the country office of UN Women, because together with the OECD and UNDP, as GPEDC, UN Women is co-custodian for the methodology of this indicator. So they are available to support you reporting on this element of the questionnaire. So do not hesitate to reach out. And then the last element here is related to the quality and the comprehensiveness of the information management systems. So you will be responding to questions related to whether the systems are actively used, what are the key characteristics of them, which type of information they collect, what's the timeline, not the timeline, but the periodicity of the data collection. So this type of questions. But more important is also that you will be reporting on whether your partners, your development partners, are actually reporting the information that you are asking them, and if they are doing it in a regular manner, and if they are providing the information indeed that you request through this information management system. So here, similarly, it's very important to coordinate with the office responsible for the information management system in the case this is not within the responsibility of your office. And again, also here, as I mentioned, you will be reporting for each partner that you have invited to report in this monitoring exercise. So moving now to the elements of the questionnaire that actually require information from your development partners. So when they open their questionnaire, they will find first questions that are related to their country-level strategies. And they will be, for example, indicating whether the strategy is also publicly available online, whether they have consulted the government, but also other partners in the definition of the priorities that they have included in their strategy. There will be also elements and questions related to leaving no one behind, so whether they have consulted or they have priorities actually in their strategy specific for women and girls, youth and children, poor, and other population groups. The second element here, so we see again, we have SDG indicator 17.15.1, and here the development partners will be actually reporting on up to 6 projects or programs that they have approved in your country, and they will be indicating information related to, for each project, they will be indicating whether the objectives of the project are actually aligned with the objectives that you have identified, that your government has identified as priorities. There will be questions to look at whether the results indicators for the interventions of the development partners are also aligned with the indicators that the government has identified. And finally, there will be questions on whether, development partners, when monitoring progress on the implementation of such projects, they make use of the data and statistics coming from your government. The next element of the questionnaire for development partners is related to information on what development partners have scheduled and what they have disbursed to your country within the reporting year of reference that you have identified for this monitoring exercise. So the information is reported by each development partner. And similar then on the last element, which is about the use of public financial management systems. Development partners here will be indicating the amount of funding that within the funds that they have disbursed to the public sector. So they will be indicating the amount that actually has been channeled using budget and auditing procedures of your government, whether they are actually making use of the financial reporting and the procurement system. And I think, yes, these are the elements for development partners. And just to recap, there are other elements that I mentioned do not require data collection at the country level. So on the quality of reporting to transparency systems, and on untied aid. And this data will be collected actually by the joint support team based on the data that is available publicly in other databases. So you can see here that so also development partners have quite an intensive reporting in some, specifically in some elements, and I would point here the element related to the SDG 17.1, 17.15.1, because they have to really go at the project level of information in order to report to this part of the questionnaire. So it will be very important that you take into account this during the data collection, and also when you are defining the timeline for the data collection and the different phases of the exercise, to make sure that then also development partners have enough time to report this information, and that then your reporting is comprehensive. And then to close, I mentioned that there are other elements of the framework that require reporting not only from the government and development partners, but also other actors. And we see here the assessment on civil society enabling environment and development effectiveness. So as I mentioned, we're going to have very soon a presentation from our colleague, Matt, on the specific of this assessment. So here I will just mention that for this questionnaire, actually, all the questions are responded by each focal point. So one for the government, one for the development partners, and one for the civil society organizations. And it's therefore very, very important that the views that the focal points bring are really representative of the constituency they represent. And the second element is, again, the Kampala Principle Assessment, and Ashley will explain in more detail that assessment at the end of this afternoon. So I think with this, I'll stop here, and we are happy to respond to any questions and provide clarification on this part.
So we're going to start today with the session about the Kampala Principles Assessment, which we decided to move to this morning. So for this session, I'm going to start by giving a kind of overview of the Kampala Principles Assessment, and then we're going to hear from some of the different stakeholders about what they value in this, and then there'll be a chance for questions. And then we're going to go, I think at that point, and have a coffee break. So I think that you are aware that the Kampala Principles Assessment is a new aspect of the monitoring framework. And this was developed in response to requests and enthusiasm from stakeholders to have more evidence related to engagement with the private sector, given how important the private sector is to achieving the SDGs and to the partnership landscape in so many countries. So before we look at the assessment itself, just to situate ourselves, so in the framework that Valentina presented yesterday, this is the component here, which is where the Kampala Principles Assessment. So everything that I'm going to present is about the evidence that is collected in this component. So it fits within the framework under the whole of society, although it does have elements, the Kampala Principles Assessment, which relate to many of the 4 principles and is generally very relevant to the effectiveness agenda. So before we look at the assessment itself, I want to talk a little bit about where this came from. So first of all, this is an assessment of the Kampala Principles, the implementation of the Kampala Principles. So what are the Kampala Principles? So these are 5 principles that were developed. They're shown here. And they're also, for those who prefer to look in French, if you have your packet from yesterday, you can see these slides in French. So these Kampala Principles look at the effectiveness of partnerships with the private sector. And they look specifically at private sector partnerships which use ODA resources, international development cooperation resources. So it's quite specific to the niche of the GPEDC. This is not about, the Kampala principles are not about all engagement with the private sector at the country level. It's specifically about partnerships and engagement with the private sector using development cooperation resources. And so what are we really talking about here? We all know that there is just a very big financing gap with the SDGs, and that the private sector is a very important part of the solution. However, the Kampala Principles is not about the amount of finance that is mobilized for the private sector or by the private sector. It's not about the amount or the quantity of private sector finance. It's about kind of the other side of the coin, which is about the quality of the partnerships. There are other frameworks, there are other assessments which look at the amount of resources, the leveraging of private sector resources, the impact of private sector resourcing. That's not what the Kampala Principles are about. What the Kampala Principles are about is really the enabling environment at the country level for effective partnerships with the private sector using development cooperation resources. And like I said, this is the niche of the GPEDC. So what we're looking at in these private sector partnerships is looking at the principles, looking at issues of ownership, looking at issues of transparency of these type of partnerships, of inclusivity, of dialogue, these kind of issues which you'll recognize are very similar to overall the issues that we collect evidence on through the framework. In terms of where the Kampala Principles came from, I won't go into a lot of detail about this timeline, but I do want to point out that the Kampala Principles really were developed through a very inclusive process. Some of the people in this room were very involved in this, and the Kampala Principles themselves were officially launched in 2019. But even from the time of the Nairobi high-level meeting, there was a real recognition of the importance of looking at the quality of partnerships with the private sector. Following the launch of the Kampala Principles themselves was when there was a development of the Kampala Principles assessment, which is what we have in the monitoring framework. Along the way, so over the last couple of years, the Kampala Principles assessment was developed as part of the monitoring reform that we did over the last couple of years. In addition, there is also a toolkit for the Kampala Principles which is available, which provides a lot of good practices and case studies and examples of how to implement the Kampala Principles themselves. And then the Kampala Principles assessment was approved and launched as part of the new monitoring framework at the Geneva Summit in December. So this is just to say that there's been a long and inclusive process to develop the Kampala Principles and the assessment. So if we look now at the assessment, so that component of the Kampala Principles assessment, which I'm going to now say the KPA, just because it's a bit of a mouthful, is a unique assessment which looks at private sector engagement in development cooperation, and like I said, at the enabling environment for these partnerships. It is an integral part of the monitoring framework, and it follows the same process. So for those countries, which we hope will be many, who choose to do the Kampala Principles assessment, the KPA is an optional part of the monitoring framework. It is recognized that in some countries, it will be very, very relevant to do the KPA to really focus on the private sector engagement. In other countries, that might be less of a priority, so it is optional. And the national coordinator, of course, is the one who, in consultation with your government, makes a decision about whether to do the KPA as part of the overall monitoring exercise. Excuse me. Another very unique aspect of the KPA is that it has this very unique multi-stakeholder reporting process. So there is actually a role to report data from these 5 constituency groups listed here: the partner country government, the private sector itself, trade unions, development partners, and also civil society. If we look a bit at this reporting process, and this is quite specific to how you will collect data on the KPA. These are a little bit more detail about who would need to report. So as national coordinator, as I mentioned, the government will answer the questionnaire on the KPA and will provide one consolidated response. So essentially, the national coordinator would need to consult across relevant ministries that deal with private sector engagement processes and then respond to the KPA questionnaire in one consolidated government response. So that's quite similar to the rest of the questionnaires that require government data. The development partners, on the other hand, will each individually respond to the KPA questionnaire. So if you choose in your country to do the KPA, all of the development partners that you invite to report data in general to the various components that Valentina explained you need development partner data, they will also respond to the KPA questionnaire. However, not all development partners actually are engaged in private sector projects. So although all the development partners will be asked to respond to the KPA questionnaire, the first question they will see is about, do you have projects with the private sector? And if they do, then they would proceed and respond to the questionnaire. If they don't, it's a filter question and they won't respond to it. So in reality, probably only some of your development partners are going to respond to the KPA questionnaire, because it's only for those development partners that are actually having projects and programs which engage the private sector. For the civil society, as well as for the rest listed here, it's a similar focal point system. So you would again need to identify one civil society representative who would be asked to consult across civil society to respond to provide one consolidated response. In terms of the profile, depending on your country context, it is possible that this CSO focal point could be the same CSO focal point that you've identified for the enabling environment assessment that Matt talked about yesterday. It's also possible that it could be a different one. There's probably a rationale for thinking about it being a different focal point, because here, I think we've lost the slide. Oh, okay. No, go back, please, sorry. Yeah. So here, you'll want to identify a civil society focal point who hopefully is working is working on private sector engagement, either in implementing or in a watchdog role. So you'll want to think about the relevance of the civil society focal point. There's similarly a need to identify a trade union focal point with the same type of thinking about trade unions who hopefully are involved in private sector engagement that uses development cooperation. And then in terms of the private sector reporting, when in developing this assessment, it was decided that there was a very strong rationale for recognizing that there's a diversity of private sector, right? So having one private sector focal point to cover all kinds of private sector would not be appropriate. So you're asked to actually identify one private sector focal point, which would get responses from larger kind of multinational export-oriented private sector firms, and then a different focal point for smaller who would represent the views and consult across private sector, which is more small and medium-sized enterprises, micro enterprises, social enterprises and cooperatives. So there is, quite a diversity of data that would come in, and this is how it would work. Okay, and then the last part of my presentation is going to be about what evidence are we talking about? What are we actually going to learn about the private sector engagement enabling environment through the KPA? The assessment itself, and with the evidence, gathers evidence on 4 issues, which we call 4 key metrics, but it's really 4 issues, which you can see here. And I'm going to go through them one by one. Across these, there's also an attempt to actually mainstream issues of leaving no one behind. So I'll give a couple of examples of that as we go through. But these are the 4 areas that the assessment will collect evidence on. The first of the issues, the first of the key metrics, is about the state of policies on private sector engagement in development cooperation. The main reporters on this metric are both the partner country government and the development partners. And this metric looks at whether both the partner country government as well as the development partners have private sector engagement through development cooperation policies or strategies in place, whether those policies or strategies have been designed in an inclusive way, whether they have specific targets and so forth. But then in addition to getting that information from the partner country government and the development partners about their own policies and strategies, from the other respondents, the trade unions, the civil society, the private sector, they're also asked whether or not they're aware of such policies and whether they've also developed their own guidelines as well. For the second of the key issues is about dialogue. And here, again, partner country governments and development partners there's a number of questions about whether they've held dialogues related to private sector engagement and development cooperation, and then also whether those dialogues are inclusive, how relevant the topics are that are discussed at those, and whether those dialogues have resulted in multi-stakeholder collaboration. And the other respondents, the civil society, the trade unions, the private sectors, are also invited to give their views and perceptions, for example, on whether they've been involved in dialogues, whether they feel that the topics discussed are relevant, whether those dialogues have led to collaboration. The third of the issues is about the quality of private sector engagement in development cooperation. And there's a number of different pieces of evidence that come out through this one. There are some questions about whether the different partnerships for private sector engagement are delivering development results where needed the most. So this is one example where the concept of leaving no one behind is brought in, whether the results are in a particular country reaching those most in need. There are also questions about whether the private sector engagement partnerships and initiatives are building the capacities of the domestic private sector, of civil society, of trade unions, and whether the private sector engagement initiatives are aligned to relevant national standards and international standards. Also, something that came out very strongly in the consultations to develop this assessment was the importance of looking at whether development partners are using inclusive due diligence processes, as well as whether both the partner country governments and the development partners have grievance mechanisms and grievance processes, for private sector initiatives. And then finally, the last one is very important, which is about the ease of partnering. So this on private sector. So all of the different stakeholder groups who report data, all those that I showed you, have the opportunity to actually list what they feel are some of the bottlenecks and challenges to partnerships with the private sector and to accessing resources from development partners for these type of partnerships. And this was deemed, very important in order for this assessment to generate information that could be discussed in the dialogue about, okay, what are the actual bottlenecks in this country? Where are they coming from? What's needed to overcome these challenges? So my final slide is just to give one example of, if we look back at just one of those issues, one of those metrics, what does it look like? What would we come out of this assessment with? So this is just a bit of a snapshot. So if we look at the first key metric about the state of policies in private sector engagement and development cooperation, this is just a mock-up of the kind of evidence that would come out. So we would see for the partner country government of a partner country, we would have information about the existence of a policy, so whether the partner country government has a policy, information about how comprehensive, does it cover all the geographic regions, does it cover all sectors, these kind of information. Also about the inclusiveness, so who was consulted and involved in developing that policy. For that same country, from the reporting from the development partners, we would also know, do the individual development partners, at least those who are working with the private sector, do they have policies? What are the kind of features and characteristics of their policies? And then what kind of processes and inclusivity? At the same time, we would also have information from civil society, trade unions, the smaller private sector, the larger private sector, on whether they're aware of the policies of the government as well as of the development partners. So this is kind of a bit of a mock-up of some of the main information that we would be getting just for one of the key issues.